Everybody is asking where Nancy Guthrie is, but almost no one is asking if she is alive or dead, or what actually happened on her porch that night. For decades, her house sat quietly in the foothills outside Tucson. Neighbors remember the lights turning on at dusk, the quiet routine of someone living peacefully in a place she had called home for years. Inside that house lived 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. On the night of January 31st, nothing about her evening appeared unusual. She had spent time with family. She returned home later that night, and by all accounts, everything seemed normal. But sometime after midnight, something changed. A doorbell camera outside Nancy Guthrie's front door recorded a man approaching the house. He was wearing dark clothing, his face was covered. Within seconds, he reached toward the camera. Then the video went dark. 41 minutes later, Nancy Guthrie was gone. No one saw her leave. No emergency call was made from the house, and the only evidence investigators found outside the door raised more questions than answers. In the weeks that followed, the case took several unexpected turns. Messages appeared claiming Nancy had been kidnapped. Millions of dollars were demanded. But investigators quickly noticed something strange about those messages. There was no clear way to respond. No phone number, no negotiation, and no proof that Nancy Guthrie was still alive. Which raises a difficult question. Was Nancy Guthrie really kidnapped? Or did something go terribly wrong on that porch before those messages were ever sent? Today we are going to walk carefully through the evidence. The video, the timeline, the blood on the porch, and the 41 minutes investigators believe may hold the answer to what really happened that night. Because somewhere within those 41 minutes, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. And understanding what happened during that time may be the key to answering the question people have been asking since the beginning. Is Nancy Guthrie dead or alive? But to understand what happened that night, we have to start with the moment the camera went dark. In the early hours of February 1st, something happened outside Nancy Guthrie's home. Something that would turn a quiet neighborhood in the foothills outside Tucson into the center of a national investigation. At first, no one noticed. There were no alarms, no emergency calls, no sounds that immediately alerted neighbors, but a small device mounted beside the front door had recorded something important. Like many homes today, Nancy's house had a doorbell camera. The device was designed to do something simple: record anyone who approached the front door. Most of the time, it captured ordinary moments. A delivery driver dropping off a package, a neighbor stopping by, a visitor ringing the bell. But during the early hours of that morning, the camera recorded something different. A person approaching the house. The figure appeared to be a man. He was dressed in dark clothing. His face was partially hidden behind a mask. And because of the limited lighting, it was difficult to see clear identifying features. But several details stood out. The man moved calmly. He did not run. He did not appear nervous. Instead, he walked directly toward the front door, as if he already knew where he was going. For a few seconds, he stood in front of the camera. Then he reached toward it. What happened next would become one of the most important moments in the entire case. The camera stopped recording. Investigators later determined the device had been physically removed from its mount. Before disconnecting it, the person appeared to cover the lens with vegetation or debris, possibly attempting to block the camera's view. And just like that, the video ended. From the camera's perspective, the night simply went dark. At the time, no one realized anything unusual had happened. The house remained quiet. There were no emergency calls from the property during those early morning hours. Nothing that immediately signaled that something was wrong. But by the next morning, the situation looked very different. Nancy Guthrie was gone. There were no signs she had left the house voluntarily. Her belongings were still inside. Nothing suggested she had simply stepped out for a walk or gone somewhere unexpectedly. Instead, the evidence pointed to something far more troubling. Nancy had disappeared during the night. And the doorbell camera footage quickly became one of the most important clues investigators had. The video showed that someone had approached the house during the hours when Nancy was likely asleep. More importantly, that person had deliberately disabled the camera. That detail immediately raised a critical question. Why disable the camera at all? Turning off a camera is not something that happens by accident. It suggests the person knew the camera was there and wanted to prevent it from recording what happened next. Investigators began examining the footage frame by frame. The man's clothing appeared dark and loose. He wore gloves that covered his hands. On his back was what appeared to be a small backpack. His face remained partially hidden by the mask. The lighting made it difficult to determine clear identifying features, but his behavior revealed something important. He did not appear surprised by the camera. In fact, his movements suggested the opposite. He seemed to approach it intentionally. That raised another question investigators had to consider. Was this person simply someone who noticed the camera at the last moment? Or had he come to the house already knowing it was there? The timing of the footage would soon become just as important as the person captured in it. Investigators determined that the moment the camera went dark marked the beginning of a narrow window of activity that night. Later analysis suggested that roughly 40 minutes passed between the camera being disabled and another critical event connected to Nancy's health monitoring system. Those 40 minutes would become one of the most closely examined time periods in the entire investigation. Because somewhere inside that window, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. At the beginning of the case, however, investigators did not yet know what had happened during that time. All they knew was that a masked individual approached the house. The camera went dark, and after that moment, Nancy Guthrie was never seen again. As news of the disappearance spread, the quiet neighborhood quickly changed. Police vehicles began arriving. Investigators examined the property and surrounding area. Neighbors were asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Some reported hearing nothing at all. Others remembered small details that only seemed important afterward. A passing vehicle, a distant sound, a dog barking in the early hours of the morning. At first, the situation was treated as a missing person case, but the presence of the masked individual on the camera suggested something more serious may have occurred. Investigators began collecting evidence from the scene. They examined the area around the front door where the camera had been mounted. They searched for fingerprints, footprints, fibers, anything that might help identify the person captured in the footage. At the same time, people started reconstructing Nancy's routine. When had she last been seen? Who had spoken with her that evening? What time had she returned home? Each of these details would help investigators understand the timeline leading up to the moment when the masked figure approached the house. The video itself was eventually released to the public. Authorities hoped someone might recognize the individual, perhaps the clothing, the posture, or something about the way he moved. Even a small observation could potentially lead to an identification. But the footage raised as many questions as it answered. The man appeared calm. He did not behave like someone who had wandered onto the property by accident. Instead, his movements suggested purpose. He walked directly to the door, disabled the camera, and then the recording ended. What happened after that moment remains unknown. Did the man enter the house? Did he attempt to force the door? Or was someone already expecting him? Those questions are central to the investigation and are answers, as you would later find out. Because once the camera went dark, there were no more recordings of what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's home that night. Everything that followed would have to be reconstructed through evidence, timelines, and careful analysis. But the brief footage captured by that doorbell camera left investigators with one unavoidable question. Who was the man on that camera, and why was he there? Before we can understand what happened on Nancy Guthrie's porch that night, or even start seeking answers, we first need to understand the person at the center of the case. Who was Nancy Guthrie? For many people following the story, the first detail they heard was her age. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared. This also brings the nagging question of if Nancy Guthrie was a victim of elder abuse. But age alone did not describe her life. Friends and neighbors described someone who remained active and engaged well into her later years. She had lived for decades in the foothills outside Tucson, in a neighborhood known for its quiet streets and desert landscape. Over the years, that house had become more than just a place to live. It was where Nancy built her routines, where she spent time with family, and where neighbors had grown used to seeing the familiar rhythm of her daily life. The neighborhood itself was considered calm and predictable. Most evenings passed quietly. Porch lights turned on as the sun went down, and by late night the streets were usually empty. Nothing about the area suggested it was a place where a violent crime might occur. That was one of the reasons Nancy's disappearance felt so unsettling to the people who lived nearby. Nancy was also known nationally for another reason. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a well-known television journalist and co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. Because of that connection, the story of Nancy's disappearance quickly spread far beyond Tucson. National media began following the investigation almost immediately. But within the family, the relationship was much simpler. Nancy was a mother and grandmother. Family members visited regularly. She spent time with them often, maintaining the kind of close connections that many families build over decades. Although she lived alone, she was not isolated. Her children remained involved in her life, checking in and helping when needed. By the time Nancy reached her 80s, she also faced some of the health challenges that often come with age. Reports indicated she had limited mobility and relied on medications to manage certain heart conditions. She also had a pacemaker. The device helped regulate her heart rhythm and transmitted certain health data electronically to her medical providers. Later in the investigation, that device would become an unexpected source of information. But at the time, it was simply part of her daily life. Despite these health concerns, people close to Nancy said she valued her independence. She preferred to make her own decisions. She maintained her own home. And she continued following routines that allowed her to stay connected with the community around her. That independence was important to her. In many ways, her life appeared stable and predictable. And when investigators begin examining a missing person case, that stability becomes important. We usually start with simple questions. Did the person have conflicts with anyone? Were there financial problems? Did they interact regularly with unfamiliar people? In Nancy's case, those questions did not immediately produce clear answers. Neighbors reported no disputes. There were no widely known conflicts. Nothing in her daily life appeared to explain why someone would approach her home in the middle of the night. And that made the case more difficult to understand. Because when someone disappears under unusual circumstances, investigators often look for motives connected to the victim's life. Yet Nancy's routine seemed ordinary. Her relationships appeared stable. There was no obvious reason someone would target her house. But there was one factor investigators could not ignore. Nancy's connection to a high-profile media figure meant that any crime involving her would quickly attract national attention. That possibility raised another difficult question. Was Nancy herself the intended target? Or was someone connected to her the real focus? At that stage of the investigation, authorities had no clear evidence pointing in either direction. What they did know was that Nancy's life followed a predictable pattern. And understanding that pattern would help investigators reconstruct the final hours before she vanished. Because on the evening before her disappearance, Nancy had followed a routine that initially appeared completely normal. She spent time with family. She returned home later that night. Nothing about those hours seemed unusual. But when we later reconstructed the timeline, they realized something important. The key question was not only who approached Nancy's house after midnight. It was what happened during the hours before that moment. Because somewhere within that timeline, something changed. Something that eventually led to a masked figure standing outside Nancy Guthrie's front door. And to understand how that moment happened, we need to carefully examine the final hours of Nancy Guthrie's evening. What exactly happened in the hours before Nancy disappeared? To understand what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's home later that night, we first need to reconstruct the final ordinary hours of her evening. In missing person cases, we often begin with a simple starting point. The last confirmed moment when the person was known to be safe. For Nancy Guthrie, that moment appears to have taken place earlier on the evening of January 31st. According to reports, Nancy had spent part of that evening with family members. The gathering was routine. Family members later described it as a normal visit, the kind of quiet time many families share without thinking much about it. conversation, time together. Nothing that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Later that evening, Nancy returned home. She was dropped off at her house in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson. This moment is important as it would help us establish the beginning of the timeline. At some point later in the evening, the garage door closed. After that, Nancy was believed to be inside the house alone. From the outside, everything appeared normal. The neighborhood followed the same pattern it did most nights. As the evening progressed, lights in nearby homes gradually turned off. Residents went to sleep. Traffic on the streets slowed until the area became almost completely quiet. For investigators reviewing the case later, that quiet environment would become an important detail. In neighborhoods like this, unusual activity often stands out. A vehicle driving slowly down the street, footsteps where no one normally walks at night. Even distant sounds can draw attention when most people are asleep. But according to early reports from neighbors, very few people noticed anything unusual during the hours leading up to midnight. Many residents had already gone to bed. Others remained inside their homes, unaware that anything out of the ordinary might be happening nearby. The lack of witnesses created an immediate challenge for investigators. Without people awake to observe the street, detectives had fewer direct accounts of what might have occurred during the night. Because of this, investigators turned to other sources of information. They began reviewing surveillance cameras in the surrounding area. Doorbell cameras mounted on nearby homes, security cameras facing driveways and streets, even traffic cameras located along nearby roads. Each camera had the potential to capture small fragments of the timeline. A passing vehicle, a person walking along the street. Even a few seconds of footage could help investigators narrow down when something unusual might have occurred. At the same time, detectives began examining Nancy's activity inside the home during the hours after she returned. Did she make phone calls? Did she send messages? Did any electronic devices in the house record activity? These digital traces can sometimes reveal small details about a person's routine. A phone connecting to a wireless network, a device activating late at night. Even subtle signals can help investigators determine whether someone was awake or moving inside a home. But at this stage, nothing suggested that anything unusual had happened earlier in the evening. The house appeared quiet. There were no emergency calls from the property, no alarms triggered, nothing that indicated a disturbance had taken place before midnight. And that calm timeline made what happened later even more difficult to explain. Because when investigators later reviewed the events surrounding Nancy's disappearance, they realized something important. The hours leading up to midnight appeared completely ordinary. Yet sometime after midnight, someone approached the house, and that person appeared to know exactly where they were going. Investigators also began examining reports of suspicious activity that may have occurred near the neighborhood days before Nancy disappeared. One piece of footage reportedly showed a person moving in an unusual way along a nearby road. In the video, the individual appeared to be walking backward. The reason for that movement was unclear. Some investigators suggested a person might walk backward to avoid showing their face clearly to security cameras. Others cautioned that the footage might have nothing to do with the case at all. Still, the possibility raised an important question. What if someone had been watching the house before that night? In some investigations, offenders observe a property days or even weeks before committing a crime. They study routines, when lights turn on and off, when people arrive or leave, whether the resident lives alone, and where security cameras are positioned. If that kind of surveillance had taken place, it could suggest planning rather than a random encounter. But at this stage of the investigation, there was no confirmation that the person seen earlier was connected to Nancy's disappearance. For now, let's focus on the timeline we can verify. Nancy returned home. The neighborhood grew quiet. The hours passed without any sign of disturbance. Then, sometime after midnight, someone approached the house. That person appeared briefly on the doorbell camera mounted near the front door. Moments later, the camera went dark. And when investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events, they realized the calm hours before midnight made the later activity even more unusual. Because in a neighborhood where almost nothing happens during the night, a masked individual approaching a house raises an obvious question. Why would someone come to Nancy Guthrie's home at that hour? Were they searching for someone? Attempting a burglary? Or had they arrived with a specific plan already in mind? Answering those questions would require examining what happened after midnight. The moment the masked figure appeared on the porch, and the 40-minute window that followed. Which leads to the next question. Why would someone approach Nancy Guthrie's home in the middle of the night? When investigators first reviewed the doorbell camera footage, they realized the case might revolve around a surprisingly small period of time. Not an entire night, not even several hours, but a window of roughly 40 minutes. The moment the camera went dark became the first marker in that timeline. The video showed the masked figure walking calmly toward the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson. He moved directly toward the camera. He appeared aware of it. Within seconds, he reached forward. Then, the recording stopped. Later examination suggested the camera had been deliberately disabled. Investigators believed the device was removed from its mount. Before disconnecting it, the person appeared to cover the lens with vegetation or debris, possibly trying to block the view. After that moment, the video ended. And from that point forward, the timeline became much harder to see. Because once the camera stopped recording, investigators no longer had direct footage of what was happening outside the house. Everything that followed would have to be reconstructed from other evidence. But detectives soon discovered something else that helped define the timeline. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker. The device helped regulate her heart rhythm and transmitted certain health data wirelessly through a connection with her phone. Normally, that connection remained active. But during the early hours of the morning, something unusual happened. The pacemaker stopped transmitting. When investigators compared the timestamps, they noticed a striking detail. The gap between the camera being disabled and the pacemaker losing connection was approximately 41 minutes. That discovery immediately drew attention, because it suggested that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie likely occurred within that narrow window. Somewhere inside those 41 minutes, she disappeared. Understanding what took place during that time became one of the central challenges of the investigation. Detectives began searching for any piece of information that might help fill the gap. They reviewed surveillance cameras in the surrounding area. They examined nearby traffic footage. They looked for vehicles that might have entered or left the neighborhood during the early morning hours. Even small details could help narrow the timeline. In neighborhoods like the Catalina foothills, homes are often spaced far apart. Some streets have security cameras, others have almost none. Because of this, investigators had to piece together fragments of information from multiple sources. One camera might show a vehicle passing through an intersection. Another might capture movement along a nearby road. Even if these recordings did not directly show the suspect, they could still help investigators determine whether unfamiliar vehicles were moving through the area around the time Nancy disappeared. At the same time, detectives returned to Nancy's property. They examined the entrance where the doorbell camera had been removed. They studied the ground around the porch. They searched for footprints, tire tracks, anything that might show how the person approached the house. Sometimes these details reveal whether someone arrived on foot or by vehicle. They can also indicate whether more than one person may have been present. While investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline, a few small observations from neighbors began to surface. One resident reported that their dog had woken unexpectedly during the early morning hours. The dog stood alert and stared in the direction of Nancy's home. At the time, the behavior seemed insignificant. But once investigators identified the 40-minute window, details like that became harder to ignore. Animals sometimes react to sounds or movement that people might not notice. A slow-moving vehicle, footsteps in a quiet yard, voices carried through the still night air. These reports could not confirm exactly what happened, but they suggested that activity may have occurred near the house during the time Nancy disappeared. Investigators also examined reports of unusual electronic disruptions in the neighborhood. Some residents later said that certain security cameras briefly lost their internet connection during the same early morning period. The cause of these disruptions was not immediately clear. Wireless networks sometimes fail for ordinary reasons: temporary outages, signal interference, routine technical problems. But investigators could not ignore another possibility. Some devices are capable of interfering with wireless signals and disabling nearby cameras. Equipment like this has occasionally been used in criminal activity to disrupt surveillance systems. At that stage of the investigation, authorities did not confirm whether such a device had been used. They simply documented the reports and continued examining the evidence. But one fact became increasingly clear. The critical events in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance were concentrated within a very short period of time. The camera was disabled. Roughly 40 minutes later, the pacemaker connection stopped transmitting. After that, there were no confirmed signs of Nancy's activity. Somewhere within that narrow window, something had happened, and the timeline alone could not explain what it was. To answer that question, investigators needed to examine the physical evidence left behind at the scene. Because when detectives carefully studied the ground near Nancy's front porch, they noticed something unexpected. Not a broken door. Not signs of forced entry. Something much smaller. Several droplets of blood on the ground near the entrance. Those droplets would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, and my major reason for asking if Nancy Guthrie is still alive. The blood noticed on the ground near the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home was small. So small that it might have been overlooked without careful attention. At first glance, they did not appear dramatic. They were not large pools of liquid, just a few scattered spots on the surface of the porch. But experienced investigators know that details like this can be important, because even a small amount of physical evidence can reveal what happened during a brief moment. The droplets were collected and sent for forensic testing. The results confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The substance was blood, and the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. That discovery immediately changed the direction of the case. Until that point, investigators were dealing with a disappearance. A person had gone missing from her home. But the presence of Nancy's blood outside the front door suggested that something else had happened at the scene. Something physical. Something that may have involved an injury. Forensic specialists began studying the droplets carefully. Blood evidence can sometimes reveal how an incident unfolded. The size and shape of droplets may indicate whether a person was standing, moving, or struck during an encounter. According to reports discussed publicly during the investigation, the droplets on the porch appeared small and relatively round. Some analysts noted that patterns like this are often consistent with blood falling from a person who is upright. In other words, the person bleeding may have been standing or moving when the droplets reached the ground. That observation raised an important possibility. Nancy may have been injured while standing near the doorway. Perhaps she opened the door and encountered someone outside. Even a brief struggle could produce droplets like the ones investigators found. Blood from the nose or mouth can fall in small drops if a person is struck or pushed during a confrontation. But we have to consider several possibilities. The injury might have been minor, or it might have been part of a much more serious event that occurred very quickly. The location of the droplets raised another important question. They were found outside the house, not in the living room, not in a hallway, but directly on the porch near the entrance. This suggested that the key moment of the incident may have occurred at the doorway itself, possibly at the exact place where the masked figure had been standing just moments before the camera stopped recording. Another detail in the pattern also drew attention. The droplets appeared relatively contained. They did not form a long trail across the ground. Investigators did not initially observe signs that someone had been dragged away from the entrance. That left several possible explanations. Nancy may have been injured briefly, but remained conscious. The encounter may have lasted only seconds. A sudden moment that produced a few drops before the situation changed. Forensic specialists also examined the shape of the droplets themselves. Some reports describe the drops as having lighter centers, a pattern sometimes referred to as a donut appearance. This type of shape can occur when blood falls from the nose or mouth, where air mixes with the liquid as it drops. If that interpretation was correct, it could suggest that Nancy suffered an injury to the face during the encounter. But blood evidence rarely provides a complete explanation on its own. Each observation must be considered alongside other evidence from the scene. The masked figure captured on the doorbell camera, the camera that had been deliberately disabled. The 41-minute window between the camera going dark and Nancy's pacemaker losing connection. And now, the discovery of Nancy's blood on the porch. Taken together, these details began to change how we can view the case. Early in the investigation, some believed Nancy might have been kidnapped. But the blood outside the house complicated that theory. In most ransom kidnappings, the victim is taken alive. The offender intends to use the victim as leverage. But if the plan had been to kidnap Nancy, the injury at the doorway raised an important question. Why was there evidence of blood? Did a struggle occur before she was taken? Was the injury accidental? Or did something more serious happen in those moments after the camera went dark? Investigators could not yet answer those questions. But one thing had become clear. Nancy Guthrie had not simply walked away from her home. Something had happened at that doorway. Something that left physical evidence behind. And that evidence suggested the encounter may have unfolded very quickly. Only a few seconds. A brief confrontation. A small number of droplets left behind on the porch. Those droplets would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Because they suggested that whatever happened that night may have begun right outside Nancy's front door, in the same place where the masked figure had been standing just moments before the camera went dark. Which raises the next question investigators needed to answer. If violence occurred on the porch, what happened next? In many investigations, suspects are identified through fingerprints, DNA, or eyewitnesses. But in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, one of the most important clues came from something much simpler, a short video. The footage came from the doorbell camera mounted outside Nancy's home in the foothills near Tucson. The recording lasted only a few seconds before the device was disabled. But during that brief moment, investigators captured the first image of the person who approached the house that night. Detectives studied the video carefully. They slowed the footage down. They examined individual frames, because sometimes the smallest detail in a video can reveal something important. The person captured on the camera appeared to be male. Investigators estimated his height at roughly 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches. His build appeared average. His face was partially concealed by a mask, making identification difficult. However, investigators believed dark facial hair may have been visible around the area not covered by the mask. The clothing worn by the suspect also drew attention. He appeared to be dressed in dark layers. That choice may not have been unusual for someone outside late at night, but dark clothing can also help a person blend into poorly lit environments. Several other details stood out. The suspect appeared to be wearing gloves. Gloves are often used by individuals attempting to avoid leaving fingerprints. Their presence suggested that the person may have taken steps to avoid leaving evidence behind. He also carried what appeared to be a small backpack. The bag was visible as he walked toward the front door. Investigators could not immediately determine what the backpack contained, but its presence suggested that the person may have arrived prepared. In some cases, backpacks carry tools used to break into homes. In others, they contain equipment used to disable security devices or conceal identity. The video itself revealed something equally important: the suspect's behavior. People who accidentally wander onto a property often appear hesitant. They pause, they look around, they hesitate before approaching a door. But the individual captured on Nancy's camera did not appear uncertain. He walked directly toward the entrance. He did not hesitate. He did not appear surprised by the camera. Instead, his movements suggested that he already knew where he was going. When the suspect reached the doorbell camera, he extended his hand toward it. Within seconds, the recording stopped. Later analysis suggested that the device had been physically removed from its mount. Before disconnecting it, the suspect appeared to place vegetation or debris over the lens. The sequence was brief but deliberate. cover the lens, remove the device, end the recording. Those actions suggested the suspect understood what the camera was and how to disable it. And that raised an important question. How did he know the camera was there? Doorbell cameras are common, but their exact placement can vary from house to house. In this case, the suspect did not appear to search for the device. He reached directly toward it. That detail led investigators to consider several possibilities. One possibility was that the suspect had noticed the camera during an earlier visit to the area. Another possibility was that he had studied the property beforehand. In some crimes, offenders observe a location days or even weeks in advance. They study routines, when lights turn on and off, when residents leave or return, where security cameras are mounted. If that had happened here, the suspect may have already known exactly where the camera was located. Investigators also paid close attention to the suspect's body language. His movements appeared calm. He did not rush. He did not appear nervous. Some analysts later suggested that his behavior looked almost routine, as if disabling the camera was something he expected to do. But the video also showed something else. Although the suspect appeared prepared in certain ways, his actions were not perfectly executed. Covering the lens with vegetation is not the most effective way to disable a camera. Someone with technical experience might approach the situation differently. This combination of preparation and improvisation made the suspect difficult to interpret. He appeared organized enough to wear gloves and conceal his face, but he also seemed to improvise once he reached the door. Investigators also examined another detail visible in the footage. Some analysts believed the suspect may have been carrying a small device attached near his clothing. The object resembled something with a short antenna. Experts later discussed the possibility that it could have been a communication device, such as a walkie-talkie. Devices like this are sometimes used to communicate with someone nearby. However, investigators cautioned that the video quality made it difficult to confirm exactly what the object was. It might have been a radio. It might have been something unrelated. Still, the possibility introduced an important question. If the suspect was communicating with someone else, he might not have been alone. In some crimes, one person approaches the house while another waits nearby. A second person might remain inside a vehicle. They may act as a lookout, or they may be prepared to drive away quickly once the event is over. The doorbell camera footage only showed one individual, but the possibility of a second person could not be ruled out. Because once the camera went dark, investigators no longer had a visual record of what happened outside the house. Everything that followed would have to be reconstructed from other evidence. Still, the image captured in those few seconds became one of the defining visuals of the entire case. A quiet porch, a masked figure approaching the door, and a camera that suddenly stopped recording. For investigators, identifying that individual became one of the most urgent priorities. Because if they could determine who the masked man was, they might finally understand what happened during those 41 minutes. But the video also raised another question. If the suspect appeared prepared to disable the camera, was he acting alone? The case began with a video. Then investigators discovered blood on the porch. But the most important clues would come from something less visible. Forensic evidence. In the days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, investigators began examining every trace left behind at the property and in the surrounding area. Crime scene investigators moved slowly through the home and the grounds outside. They photographed surfaces. They collected samples. They searched for fibers, footprints, and anything that might reveal who had been there during the night Nancy vanished. In many cases, the most important evidence is not immediately obvious. Sometimes it appears later, discovered during a search far away from the original scene. That is exactly what happened here. During a search of nearby areas, investigators located an item roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. A pair of gloves. The discovery immediately caught their attention. The masked man captured on the doorbell camera had appeared to be wearing gloves when he approached the house. If the gloves found nearby matched what the suspect had been wearing, they could be directly connected to the person seen on the video. But investigators could not assume the connection. Gloves can be dropped for many ordinary reasons. Someone might lose them accidentally. They might be discarded by a passerby. So detectives treated the discovery carefully. The gloves were collected and sent for forensic testing. Scientists would examine both the inside and outside surfaces. Because gloves can carry two kinds of evidence, the inside may contain DNA from the person who wore them. The outside may contain fibers, soil, or other materials connected to where they were used. If the gloves had been worn during the events at Nancy Guthrie's home, they might carry traces from the environment near the property. While that testing was underway, investigators were analyzing other biological evidence collected during the investigation. And the results revealed something investigators had not necessarily expected. Two separate DNA profiles. One DNA profile came from evidence associated with the gloves found outside the immediate search area. Another profile came from biological material recovered inside Nancy's home. The discovery of two distinct DNA profiles immediately raised new questions, because in many crimes, a single offender may leave behind genetic traces. But two profiles suggest the possibility that more than one person was present. At the same time, investigators needed to approach the evidence carefully. DNA can sometimes appear at a location for reasons unrelated to a crime. A person who previously visited the house might leave traces behind without realizing it. For that reason, detectives began comparing the DNA profiles to people known to have been inside the residence. Family members, friends, anyone who might have legitimately visited the home. But according to information released during the investigation, the DNA profiles did not match members of Nancy Guthrie's family. And they have been cleared. That detail made the discovery far more significant, because it suggested that the genetic material might belong to individuals connected to the events of that night. Investigators then compared the profiles to national forensic databases. These systems contain DNA records collected from individuals who have been arrested or convicted of certain crimes. If a match appears, investigators can quickly identify the person associated with the evidence. In this case, however, the profiles did not produce an immediate match. That meant detectives would need to rely on other investigative tools. While forensic specialists examined the biological evidence, another team of investigators focused on digital information. Surveillance cameras in the surrounding neighborhoods were reviewed. Doorbell cameras from nearby houses, security cameras mounted along roads, traffic cameras from intersections and nearby businesses. Even if these cameras did not capture the suspect directly, they could reveal something important. A vehicle entering the area. A car leaving shortly after the camera at Nancy's house went dark. Analysts reviewed hours of footage. They tracked vehicles moving through nearby intersections. They compared timestamps with the moment the doorbell camera stopped recording. Each piece of footage became another fragment of the timeline investigators were trying to reconstruct. At the same time, analysts examined cellular data. Mobile phones constantly connect to nearby cell towers as people move through an area. These connections create records showing when a device was active within range of a particular tower. By reviewing that information, investigators can sometimes determine which devices were present near a location during a specific period of time. But analyzing cellular data can be complicated. Even within a short period, thousands of phones may connect to the same tower. Investigators must filter that information carefully. They narrow the list to devices that were active within the exact time window they are studying. Only then can patterns begin to emerge. Devices that appear near a location more than once, phones that move in unusual ways, signals that disappear immediately after a key event. In the Nancy Guthrie case, these digital records became part of the broader effort to understand what happened during those 41 minutes. The gloves, the DNA, the surveillance footage, the cell tower data. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the investigation. But even as the evidence grew, investigators still faced a fundamental challenge. Evidence can reveal what happened, but it does not always explain why it happened. The clues suggested that the events outside Nancy Guthrie's home may not have been random. Instead, they hinted at something more complex, possibly planning, possibly coordination, possibly more than one person involved. And that raised the question investigators needed to consider next. What does this evidence suggest about how the crime actually happened? By this point in the investigation, several important facts had already emerged. A masked man approached Nancy Guthrie's home in the middle of the night. The doorbell camera was deliberately disabled. Blood belonging to Nancy was found on the porch, and within the next 40 minutes, Nancy disappeared. Those facts were clear. What was not clear was why it happened. Understanding that question required investigators to consider several possible explanations. Each theory attempted to explain the same sequence of events, but none of them fully answered every question. One of the earliest possibilities was kidnapping. In many abduction cases, a victim is taken against their will and later used as leverage in a ransom demand. Because Nancy Guthrie's disappearance quickly attracted national attention, the idea of a kidnapping was widely discussed. In some ways, the theory seemed possible. Nancy lived alone. Her home was located in a quiet neighborhood. An offender approaching the property late at night might believe the risk of being seen was relatively low. But investigators also understood that kidnappings follow a certain pattern. If the goal is ransom, communication becomes essential. The offender must provide a way for the victim's family to respond. Without communication, a ransom demand cannot be negotiated. At first, there was no clear evidence that such communication had taken place. That did not completely eliminate the possibility of kidnapping, but it meant detectives needed to consider other explanations. Another theory involved a home invasion. Home invasions occur when offenders enter a residence expecting to find valuables, jewelry, cash, items that can be taken quickly. But several details complicated that explanation. Burglars typically try to avoid confronting residents. Their goal is usually to enter a home when no one is present. Approaching a house at night while the occupant is likely inside increases the risk of confrontation. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the suspect approached the front door directly, and the blood discovered on the porch suggested that some type of encounter may have occurred almost immediately. If the intention had been theft, investigators wondered why the situation would escalate into the disappearance of the homeowner. A third possibility involved a targeted crime. In this scenario, the offender may not have selected the home randomly. Nancy Guthrie was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a well-known television journalist. Because of that connection, any incident involving Nancy would attract significant public attention. Some analysts considered whether an individual seeking publicity might attempt to exploit that connection. Others wondered whether someone might hold a grievance connected to the family. However, investigators had to approach that idea carefully. In many cases involving victims with well-known relatives, the crime ultimately turns out to be unrelated to the public figure. At this stage of the investigation, there was no clear evidence that Nancy had been targeted because of her daughter. Still, we cannot dismiss the possibility entirely. While investigators examined these theories, another piece of evidence complicated the picture. DNA analysis had revealed two separate genetic profiles connected to the case. Two profiles suggested the possibility that more than one person might have been present. In crimes involving multiple offenders, roles are often divided. One individual may approach the property. Another may remain nearby, acting as a lookout or driver. If that scenario applied here, the masked man seen on the doorbell camera might not have been alone. Someone else could have been nearby that night, positioned somewhere outside the camera's view. The backpack carried by the suspect also raised questions about preparation. If the bag contained tools or equipment, it might indicate that the suspect arrived expecting a specific type of encounter. But as investigators compared each theory with the available evidence, a pattern began to emerge. Every explanation fit part of the story, yet none of them fit perfectly. Kidnapping required communication that had not yet appeared. Burglary did not fully explain the confrontation outside the front door, and a targeted attack required identifying a motive that had not yet been established. The case remained unresolved. Then a new development added another layer of complexity. Messages began appearing that claimed Nancy Guthrie had been kidnapped. Some of these communications were reportedly sent to media organizations. The messages demanded money. They referenced details about Nancy and her home. At first glance, these communications seemed to support the kidnapping theory. But investigators noticed something unusual. The messages did not provide a clear way to respond. There was no phone number, no email address, no private channel through which the family could communicate. In most ransom cases, the offender provides instructions for negotiation. Without communication, there is no practical way to exchange money for the victim's release. That detail raised an important question. If someone truly intended to collect ransom money, why send a message that did not allow anyone to respond? For investigators, this contradiction introduced a new possibility. What if the story of a kidnapping was not entirely accurate? What if the messages were meant to create a certain impression rather than begin a real negotiation? At that stage of the investigation, nobody has a definitive answer yet. But the unusual ransom messages became an important focus of the case, because understanding those messages might reveal something critical about what really happened that night. Which leads to the next question everyone began asking. What if the kidnapping story may not be real? Weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a new claim began circulating. Someone said they had taken her. Messages appeared that claimed Nancy had been kidnapped. But the way those messages appeared was unusual. Instead of contacting the family directly, the sender reportedly delivered the communications to media organizations, local television stations, national news outlets. Journalists began receiving messages that claimed responsibility for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The messages demanded money. Specifically, the sender requested payment in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a digital currency that allows money to be transferred electronically without traditional banking systems. Because of that, it has occasionally been used in ransom cases. At first glance, the messages seemed to confirm what many people feared. Nancy Guthrie had been taken, and someone was demanding money in exchange for her release. But investigators quickly noticed something that did not follow the usual pattern. In most ransom cases, communication is the most important part of the crime. Kidnappers need leverage. They must provide a way for the victim's family to respond. That communication might happen through a phone number, an email address, or some other private channel that allows instructions to be exchanged. Without communication, a ransom demand cannot be negotiated. But in this case, the messages reportedly did not include a clear way to respond. They demanded money. Yet they did not provide a direct channel for the family to communicate with the sender. That detail immediately raised questions. Because if someone truly intends to collect ransom money, the process depends on negotiation. The victim's family must be able to ask questions. They must receive instructions. And most importantly, they must be able to verify that the victim is still alive. That verification is known as proof of life. Proof of life is common in ransom situations. Sometimes the victim is photographed holding a current newspaper. Sometimes a voice recording is provided. Occasionally, the victim is asked to answer a question only the family would know. These methods are designed to prove that the person being held is alive. But according to investigators, no confirmed proof of life was ever provided in connection with the messages. Without proof of life, the claim of kidnapping becomes difficult to verify. Another detail also attracted attention: the decision to send the messages to the media rather than directly to the family. In genuine ransom cases, communication is usually private. The offender wants control over the negotiation. Sending demands through the media can serve a different purpose. It spreads the message quickly, it creates public pressure, and it shifts the focus of the story. Some analysts began asking an important question. What if the messages were not meant to begin a real ransom negotiation? What if they were meant to create the appearance of a kidnapping? That possibility forced investigators to look at the evidence again, because the physical clues collected at the scene told a different story. Blood belonging to Nancy had been found on the porch. The doorbell camera had captured a masked individual approaching the house. The camera had then been deliberately disabled. DNA evidence suggested that more than one person might have been involved. When detectives compared those facts with the ransom narrative, the pieces did not align perfectly. A typical ransom kidnapping requires the victim to remain alive. The offender must keep control of the victim. They must provide proof of life, and they must maintain communication with the family. But the evidence in this case suggested a confrontation had occurred outside the house. The blood on the porch indicated that Nancy had been injured during that encounter, and there was still no confirmed proof that she had been taken alive. This contradiction became one of the most important questions in the investigation. Were the ransom messages real, or were they an attempt to change how people understood what happened that night? We can also consider another possibility. What if the original plan had been different? What if something unexpected happened during the encounter on the porch? A confrontation, an injury, or someone died. A situation that unfolded in a way the suspect did not anticipate. If that had occurred, creating the story of a kidnapping might redirect attention away from the original event. Instead of focusing on what happened during those 41 minutes outside Nancy's home, the public might focus on the ransom narrative. But investigators could not assume that scenario was correct. Every possibility still had to be tested against the evidence. Detectives continued analyzing the forensic clues already collected, the DNA profiles recovered during the investigation, the surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods, the digital records that might reveal which devices were active near the property during the early morning hours. Each piece of information could bring investigators closer to identifying the people connected to the case. Because in the end, the truth behind the ransom messages may depend on one critical discovery: the identity of the individuals linked to the evidence. If investigators can determine who the masked man was, they may finally understand what happened on Nancy Guthrie's porch. And if the DNA profiles are matched to specific individuals, detectives may be able to reconstruct the events that unfolded during those 41 minutes. That is why the investigation has increasingly focused on the tools capable of identifying unknown contributors. Advanced forensic analysis, digital reconstruction of timelines, and new methods of analyzing genetic evidence. Because somewhere within those techniques may be the answer investigators have been searching for. What are investigators focusing on now? Today, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains unresolved. Investigators continue working to understand what happened during the 41 minutes that changed everything. But the investigation itself has evolved. What began as a missing person case has become a complex forensic inquiry involving multiple agencies and advanced investigative techniques. Authorities have continued examining the physical evidence collected during the early stages of the investigation. The blood droplets found on the porch, the gloves discovered miles away, and the 2 DNA profiles connected to the case. Each of these clues remains part of the effort to identify the individuals who may have been present that night. One of the most important tools investigators now rely on is genetic genealogy. This method compares unknown DNA to large databases built from voluntary ancestry submissions. Even if the exact individual has never been arrested or entered into a criminal database, distant relatives may still appear in genealogical records. By mapping those connections, investigators can sometimes narrow an unknown DNA profile to a specific family line. In recent years, this technique has helped solve cases that remained unsolved for decades. Cases where the evidence existed, but the identity behind it remained unknown. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, that same method could eventually provide the breakthrough detectives are waiting for. At the same time, investigators continue reviewing digital evidence. Surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods, traffic cameras from nearby roads, and cellular data showing which devices were active near the area during the early morning hours. Each fragment of information contributes to the timeline detectives have been building since the beginning. A timeline that begins with a masked man approaching Nancy Guthrie's home, a camera that suddenly goes dark, and a 41-minute window that investigators believe holds the key to understanding what happened. But beyond the evidence and the analysis, the case also represents something deeply personal. Nancy Guthrie was not just the subject of a national investigation. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had spent decades living in the same quiet neighborhood in the foothills outside Tucson. For her family, the case is not simply about solving a mystery. It is about finding answers, about understanding what happened during the final moments before Nancy disappeared. Authorities continue encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Sometimes the smallest detail can change the direction of an investigation. A memory of a vehicle passing through the neighborhood. A person seen walking in the area during the early hours of the morning. Even something that once seemed insignificant may become important later. Because investigations like this are often built from small pieces, fragments of information that slowly form a clearer picture. And while many questions remain unanswered, investigators believe the evidence collected so far may eventually lead them to the truth. Somewhere, someone knows what happened on Nancy Guthrie's porch that night. They know why a masked man approached the house. They know what occurred during those 41 minutes. And they know where Nancy Guthrie went after the camera stopped recording. The challenge for investigators is finding the evidence that connects those answers to the people responsible. Until that moment arrives, the case remains open. The questions remain, and the search for Nancy Guthrie continues. Because somewhere within the evidence, the timeline, and the unanswered details, the truth about what happened that night may already exist, waiting to be discovered.